these people are refugees, but Israel claims that these people aren't.
Now let's look at the recent Israel-Gaza wars. I mean, the media actually call them Israel-Hamas wars. So let's look at what happened in 2008 and 9, and let's look at both populations. How many were killed? Those are the numbers. As I'm sure you're aware, that's not what a war looks like. That's what a massacre looks like.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 30 cable stations from Vermont to New York City. On the internet at thestruggle.org. Our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. You may remember we covered the rally of thousands in New York City demanding action from the nuclear powers to abolish nuclear weapons. It took place during the review of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty at the UN that takes place every 5 years. It's the one regular chance to do something about the menace of nuclear weapons. Well, the demonstrators marched and their leaders delivered a petition with 7 million signatures. The parties met and discussed what to do for an entire month, and in the end came up with absolutely nothing. Unbelievably, it was the demands of Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu that caused the failure of the effort. The Israeli government objected to the final draft of the agreement because it would have set up a conference to discuss a nuclear-free Middle East. Obama backed the Israelis 100%, and that was the end of it. You would think, after all their hysterical chatter about Iran's supposed nuclear weapons program, Israel would want a conference about getting a nuclear-free zone in their area. But actually, they totally oppose it, because if it took place, they'd have to admit that Israel is the only country that has an arsenal of nuclear weapons. Officially, though, they say they're happy to discuss a nuclear-free Middle East, but only after all the countries of the area meet Netanyahu's security demands. Now, we are not so naive as to think that Israeli demands were the only reason for the conference failure. The brutes running the nuclear armed states generally want things to stay as they are, so they can use their nuclear weapons to scare countries that don't possess them. The conference might have failed for other reasons eventually, but that didn't need to happen as Israel destroyed the proceedings. Why should I care, you might be thinking? Well, even if there is no agreement to abolish nuclear weapons, what about other possible measures? Wouldn't it be a good thing to take nuclear weapons off of the hair trigger alerts that could launch them through a computer error or an act of madness? Wouldn't it be good to reduce the size of the nuclear arsenals? Or wouldn't it be good to stop modernization, which just is a nice way to talk about making these weapons more deadly? Anyway, all that went down the drain. You can thank Netanyahu and Obama for that. And this just in. Israel is telling Obama they'll live with a Iran deal on nuclear weapons. All they want is $900 million in compensation. Now, as refugees in the Mediterranean and the Andaman Sea make news, this from Israeli David Sheen.
There are other people for whom there is a literal butcher's slaughtering knife hanging over their heads. In recent years, between 2006 and 2012, you have 60,000 African refugees entering Israel. These are the people I spoke of earlier, mainly from Eritrea and Sudan, in East Africa. Now, by way of analogy, let me show you a few images to paint a picture. So these photographs of people walking onto a luxury liner, see them boarding the boat, ships sailing, they're on deck taking photographs. They didn't call them selfies then, they just called them photographs. So you're taking photographs and smiling and laughing and chilling and posing with their families and with their friends and on their own, and you can see clearly they're having a time of it. This guy is roller skating on deck. You see a man holding a glass of wine, casually sipping. You see other women lying in lounge chairs. Dining halls look very attractive, first-class facilities. Now, all these images I'm showing you are of the SS St. Louis. Now, I don't know if you know about this ship, but a little history lesson. So on the very eve of World War II, when it was already clear what Hitler had in mind for European Jewry, it was still possible for at least some German Jews to escape. And so you have this boat leaving, disembarking from Hamburg, and carrying on it almost 1,000 Jewish people trying to escape the Holocaust to come. And they got to North America, they crossed the Atlantic, and no country would have them. This country rejected them outright. The United States refused to accept anyone. The Caribbean countries wouldn't have it. And so, because they wouldn't take any of these Jewish refugees, the boat was forced to turn back and return to Europe, and almost all the people on board ended up perishing in the concentration camps. Now, why am I telling you this story? Yes, this man is roller skating on board. Yes, these people are sipping wine and having a good time and posing, and they're wearing nice clothes, and they're embracing, and they're smiling. But there's not one person in this room who would claim that they're not refugees. They ran away from Nazi Germany, and they were forced to return to Nazi Germany, and they died in Nazi Germany. They're refugees in any sense of the word, and I can hardly imagine anyone claiming otherwise. And yet, these people are refugees, but Israel claims that these people aren't. According to the Israeli government, these people, stuck like sardines, trying to escape any way they can, dying by the thousands, drowning in the Mediterranean, running in every direction, filling up refugee camps all over the African continent and in Europe, Africa, in other parts of the African continent, and further on in Europe and North America and Australia. But according to Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government, none of them are refugees. They are all just trying to make a quick buck. And that's why they've come to Israel. Yeah. Risking their lives, giving their lives to make a quick buck. Well, when these 60,000 African refugees came to Israel, walking through the Egyptian Sinai desert, it didn't look that different from the mythical story of the biblical exodus from Egypt. This is what the border between Egypt and Palestine looked like 100 years ago. It probably didn't look that different in 2006 when these African refugees began streaming over the border. This is, until a couple years ago, this is what the border looked like. Now clearly, it wouldn't be fun to try to get over it. There's barbed wire, you get caught in it, but obviously not insurmountable. And that's how these people entered Israel, and none of them snuck in. Every single one of them abided by international law. They crossed the border, they didn't try to go any further, they waited there. They waited for the Israeli army patrols to come by. Army came, collected them, They went where they were told to. They had medical checkups to make sure they didn't have any communicable diseases. They went through security checks to make sure they didn't have police records and they weren't terrorists. And they were allowed to enter Israel. Now, that's ended because the government wanted to end this migration to prevent any more Africans from coming into the country, and so it spent billions of dollars to build this high-tech fence along the border. So now, that's it. No more African refugees coming into the country.
As we record, Rohingyas of Burma, Muslims hated by Buddhist extremists, are now adrift by the hundreds in the Andaman Sea, looking for shelter. For Sheen's full piece, go to our website, go down to the video section. Now more of Alison Weir's talk in New Haven. Weir is the president of the Council for the National Interest.
Many people feel that they have, will tell me or say that they feel that they know what's going on in this issue because they listen to NPR. Pro-Israeli organizations consistently have attacked NPR as being pro-Palestinian in its coverage. They've caused damage to some NPR affiliates. I believe the Boston affiliate, for example, lost a lot of money because of that accusation. So Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, FAIR, a well-regarded media watchdog organization, decided to do a study of NPR's coverage of Israel-Palestine. Their researcher, Seth Ackerman, did an excellent job, and he found that, yes, indeed, NPR is very distorted on this issue, but once again in a pro-Israel direction. He gave his study a brilliant title. He called it The Illusion of Balance, because he discovered that what NPR was doing, they had carried almost the exact same number of news reports on Israeli children who had been killed as on Palestinian children who had been killed, making it seem that it was very balanced, unbiased reporting. In reality, of course, that meant that they were reporting on almost all of the deaths among one population and a very small proportion of the deaths among another population. That's not balance. That's distortion. I would suggest that's manipulation. One of our first studies was of a very typical daily newspaper, the San Jose Mercury News. This is the daily newspaper in Silicon Valley near Stanford University. In this case, we decided to look at just front page headlines. Often people are too busy to maybe read the whole paper, but at least we'll look at the front page headlines. Those are the big stories of the day. That's the important news of the day. To evaluate those, we needed a baseline. Once again, using an Israeli source, we discovered 121 Israelis had been killed by Palestinians. 384 Palestinians had been killed by Israelis. How was that covered? Which of those deaths were covered in front page headlines? Well, it turned out that they reversed the situation and increased the differential. So while that was going on, that's what it looked like. In the last 13 or 14 years, I've frequently seen when there is Palestinian violence against Israelis, we are consistently told that they have broken a period of calm, that Palestinian violence has shattered the calm. I saw a headline of that sort in 2005 in the Los Angeles Times. I was living in LA at that time. It was on their website many hours before the newspaper would be printed. So I called up the LA Times because I didn't think they would want to print a headline that was inaccurate. And I said that during a period they were saying was calm, 170 Palestinians, men, women, and children, had been killed. And that during a period they said was calm, 379 had been injured. Their response to me was, we said relative calm. And they didn't change a single word in the headline or put in any of that information. There are so many other omissions, I'll just have time for a few. There is dissent in Israel. There are soldiers refusing to serve in the occupied territories. There are women at checkpoints. There are rabbis for human rights. There are Israelis against torture. There are religious groups secular groups of many different types. It's an important phenomenon. It's a small proportion of the population, but it's significant. And yet we almost never hear about it. Most Americans don't even know that this is going on. Also, there is an extremely important nonviolence movement in the occupied territories, in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. Literally, there are weekly demonstrations, nonviolent demonstrations against Israeli oppression. Usually these weekly marches are in small villages. Quite often they are by farmers and their families, trying to use Gandhian, Dr. Martin Luther King nonviolence against the Israeli confiscation of their land and imprisonment of Palestinians. And they try to do that weekly, and yet we almost never hear about it. And it's very courageous because so often they're met with violence. And it is especially significant because often they're joined by people from around the world, of all backgrounds, of all ethnicities, of all races, etc., all ages, including Israelis. A number of Israelis come to these. And yet, again, the media almost never even mention that this exists. A number of people have been injured, maimed, killed, taking part of these. Mostly they're Palestinian. Some have been foreigners. Rachel Corrie was 23 years old. Tom Herndal was 21 years old when he was shot in the head. Others that weren't killed were shot. Brian Avery was shot in the face. Emily Hanashewitz lost an eye. Tristan Anderson is brain damaged from a projectile in his head. But almost none of these are reported. Certainly they're not headlines. Another omission of a very different sort occurred in 2003. And this one wasn't far away and out of sight. This one was in the United States on Capitol Hill. There was an independent commission in the Rayburn House office building, chaired by a 4-star admiral, Thomas Moore, who had been chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You don't get much higher rank than 4 stars and chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Also part of the commission that day on Capitol Hill was a Rear Admiral, Merlin Starring, who had been head of the whole legal department of the U.S. Navy. Also part of their commission was a Marine general, and not just any Marine general, the highest-ranking Congressional Medal of Honor recipient in the United States. They announced their findings, that Israel had attacked and tried to sink a U.S. Navy ship, that Israel had killed 34 American servicemen and injured over 170 of them, that this had constituted an act of war by Israel against the United States. They also announced that rescue flights to these men were recalled by the Secretary of Defense and the President of the United States. And they announced that this incident was ordered covered up by the President of the United States. Statements of that gravity made on Capitol Hill in a public briefing by officials of that high rank are newsworthy. And yet there was nothing about that in the Washington Post, the New York Times, USA Today, nowhere. It was the only place that I'm aware of was in the Stars and Stripes newspaper, the military newspaper abroad. And it is in the Congressional Record, where you can read about it in detail. Now let's look at the recent Israel-Gaza wars. I mean, the media actually call them Israel-Hamas wars. So let's look at what happened in 2008 and 9, and let's look at both populations. How many were killed? Those are the numbers. As I'm sure you're aware, that's not what a war looks like. That's what a massacre looks like. And then let's look at what happened last summer. The media coverage of the Gaza war last summer begins the sequence of events with 3 young Israelis who were abducted and tragically murdered. That's where they begin the sequence of events. Well, let's care about everybody, and let's look earlier in the year, starting from January 1st, and see if perhaps anything else happened preceding that. And again, we'll look at both populations. Well, we'll see in January, Palestinians were killed. Palestinians were killed in January, including a child, but apparently that doesn't count. So we'll look at February. Oh, more Palestinians were killed. And then we'll look in March, and still more Palestinians were killed, including another child, but apparently that doesn't count. Then we go to April, and we do find an Israeli and another Palestinian. And then we look at May, and more Palestinians, including 2 children. But none of that counts. Apparently none of that's newsworthy. The clock doesn't start ticking until we get to June, but not the beginning of June, because more Palestinians were killed. But then we have 3 Israelis. And that's where they begin the sequence of events. And then there's the next month. As I mentioned, they begin this with Israel supposedly protecting itself because 3 people were abducted. That was headlines. We saw their names, we were concerned about their fate for quite a while. Well, I wonder if anybody else was abducted. Again, let's look at the whole story. Were there any Palestinians, perhaps, forcibly taken from their homes and imprisoned by Israelis? Well, let's look at the number beginning from January 1st of Israelis and Palestinians through June. And here's the number. Over 2,000 Palestinians. But apparently they weren't newsworthy either. And then let's look at the aftermath. As we've seen in many disasters, the media covered the aftermath. People trying to rebuild their homes devastated, looking for bodies. Well, the aftermath of the Gaza massacre sort of went away, even though we have over 100,000 people homeless, over 10,000 people injured, in a place where most of the hospitals have been destroyed or damaged, and a place, because it was under siege by Israel, already was lacking many significant medicines, X-ray films, etc. But none of that is considered newsworthy either. When I began to look into this back in 2000 and 2001, I wondered, how did this begin? How did this, where and when, and how did this violence begin? Well, I discovered that when I was born, how did the Israeli-Palestinian conflict begin? When I was born, there was no Israel. There was Palestine. It was a region that had been there for centuries. So where and when did the violence start? Well, many people are told that it's been going on for thousands of years. The media sometimes leads one to believe that. But if you look at Palestine in the late 1800s, you find that it was inhabited by a population that was 80% Muslim, 15% Christian, and a little under 5% Jewish, all living together without violence, as they had done for centuries. So where and why did that violence begin? Well, it didn't begin there. It began far away, in Europe, and very quickly in the United States with a political movement called political Zionism, a movement to create a Jewish state on land that was 95% not Jewish, that would necessitate a major dispossession, at least. Now, what I focused on in my book is what went on in the United States. I was astounded to learn that political Zionism was an extremely important movement in the United States since the late 1800s. And it struck me that perhaps it's different in New Haven, but I think in many parts of the country, if we went out and asked people, what do you think of Zionism? What can you please define for me Zionist? My guess is that most people would say probably what I think I would have said 15 years ago. I think I've heard that word, what does it mean? We almost anybody, of course, has heard of communism and fascism and capitalism, but the average person knows very little of Zionism, doesn't probably even know that it's a movement that has existed for all of this time. And yet it has impacted our nation drastically, impacted the Middle East tragically, and impacted the whole world dangerously. And yet it's largely unknown. By 1910, Zionism in the United States had 20,000 adherents. Lawyers, professors, businessmen. It was already by 1910 becoming a phenomenon, a movement to which congressmen were listening, especially in the large cities. In 1914, a very significant development occurred. A prominent Boston attorney, Louis Brandeis, became the head of World Zionism. So World Zionism, that I had not even known existed previously, moved from Europe to Boston and was led by Louis Brandeis. 2 years later, he was appointed to the Supreme Court by Woodrow Wilson. And as we probably all know, he was a very important Supreme Court justice, highly regarded. Most of us could probably not name many Supreme Court justices from the past century. But this is one of the people most of us could name. He's certainly well regarded, and there's a university named after him. He's widely known. Well, I had not known he was the head of World Zionism. When you become a Supreme Court justice, the usual practice, ethical practice, is to resign your affiliations. You're supposed to be neutral. So outwardly and publicly, he resigned his leadership of World Zionism, but secretly he continued it. This is written about in a number of books. I was astounded to learn that because I had never heard it before, but it's well documented. And of course he did it secretly for two reasons. One reason is it was entirely improper. It was entirely unethical for a Supreme Court justice to do that, so he kept it secret. Plus, of course, some activities are more effective if they're done secretly. But then I learned even a more shocking fact about Mr. Brandeis. And I'll give you my source. By the way, if you get my book, you'll see that it is literally over half citations. So everything that I say is footnoted, and you can look into where my information came from. But what I'm next telling you, I'll give you the citation first. What I would do is I started about 14 years ago reading books on this issue. I looked for factual books. I would look at their footnotes. Then I would often order the books from those footnotes. Then I would look at those footnotes, order more books, etc. One of the books that I read was Israel in the Mind of America by a very mainstream publisher, by an establishment author named Peter Gross, who had been the diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times, was later at Harvard, then was the author of a number of nonfiction books, very establishment, respected books. One of them was this one. Well, in this book, he wrote that Louis Brandeis, while he was a Supreme Court justice, was a leader of a secret society that would work to push Zionism in the United States. I was shocked to read that, so I looked at his source. It turned out that it was a scholarly journal, the American Jewish Historical Quarterly. So then I looked at this was certainly a respected journal, so I looked at who was the author that was the source for that kind of information. The author was an Israeli professor, Dr. Sarah Schmidt. Zionism was her expertise, especially American Zionism. She's at a mainstream university in Israel. And she wrote about the Parashim. According to Schmidt and Gross and a few others, this was a secret society. The word stood for Pharisees and separate. They would spread out across the land to push Zionism throughout the United States, especially would recruit ambitious young Harvard students, but other people. Another Supreme Court Justice, Felix Frankfurter, appears also to have been a member. He was not yet a Supreme Court Justice. He was, at that time, a Harvard professor. They even had an induction ceremony in which a new member of the Parashim would swear that Zionism was more important to them than country, family, or school.
A shocking charge I've never seen made before. More of Weir's speech in a future program. To close, we have to mention an outrage in Cleveland where a judge let off a policeman who had shot a black couple 15 times after a massive car chase that started because of an illegal left turn.
Actually, the car came to a stop at what is called Heritage Middle School. The police accused the couple of trying to use their vehicle as a weapon. The family, obviously aware of the character of their loved ones, highly dispute that, especially after the autopsy reports show that there were bullets in the palm of their hands.
Bullets in the palms of their hands. How could that happen? You get that if you're raising your hands in surrender. This now from the cousin of Melissa Williams, who was shot 24 times.
Cousin! Oh, my baby cousin! I'm gonna tell y'all something right now. We have no justice. They killing kids. They killing women now. They doing whatever they want to do, and nobody is not even doing nothing about it.
It's hard to disagree with her. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.